Hi, I'm Don from DonDronesOn. Privacy is the number one concern from the general public when it comes to drones. And today I have the great pleasure to be discussing drone privacy issues with Canada's top privacy lawyer, David Fraser. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much. Nice to see you, Don.
Yeah, nice to see you too. So let's start by, well, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a privacy lawyer. I practice exclusively in the area of privacy and technology law with a Atlantic Canadian firm called McInnis Cooper. I've been practicing in this area for about 20 years now, and so these issues are coming up more and more often. And I'm also an amateur drone enthusiast with my with a couple DJI drones.
Cool.
And I have done some work for drone operators with respect to investigations by Transport Canada. So this is an interesting crossover between my hobbies and my profession, and I'm happy to share whatever knowledge or wisdom I've been able to accumulate along the way.
Let's start with the basics. Can you lay the foundation here about what are the privacy laws in Canada?
Sure. Well, we have a mix of privacy laws. You can call it a mosaic or a mess of privacy laws. And those who have been flying drones for a while will maybe have forgotten between the distinction between recreational and non-recreational with the recent changes to the regulations. But that is in fact relevant when it comes to thinking about what privacy law or what privacy rules apply. So we have a couple layers of privacy law. So we have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that affects the government, Section 8, freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, and the use of drones by police can implicate Section 8 of the Charter. That only applies to the government. Then governments are also subject to laws like the Privacy Act federally, or the Freedom of Information Protection Privacy Act in the rest of the provinces, and it's named somewhat differently in a couple other provinces. And so that's what government, provincial and federal governments are subject to. And so they can only collect personal information where they have a legitimate, lawful reason to do so. Then getting down to the folks in this audience, you're going to be thinking about PIPEDA, the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, which is our federal private sector privacy law, and their equivalents to that law in British Columbia, Alberta, and Quebec. And so those generally apply to, I think of them as commercial privacy laws. They apply to the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information in the course of a business activity. And it's a little bit broader in BC and Alberta, but generally they apply to businesses. And recreational operators who aren't doing it for any sort of a commercial purpose are not subject to any of those privacy statutes. But they're still subject to the general laws. So we have tort laws related to invasion of privacy. It's the common law in most provinces, but it's also in statutes like the Privacy Act in British Columbia, and other provinces have a statute where you can sue somebody for invasion of privacy. And in the rest of the provinces, there's torts like intrusion upon seclusion and public disclosure of private facts that might come into play, even appropriation of personality. Happy to dig a little bit deeper into what each of those involve. But in terms of what law applies to your particular activity is going to depend upon what that activity is and why you're doing it. And so if you're
so you mentioned commercial versus recreational or kind of
yeah.
private use. What about like and this has often come up in American droning videos. Where does like so for example, my channel, it's monetized. So one could say that anything I do with my drone is monetized, so it's commercial. Is that true, or is that kind of a gray area?
Well, it certainly it hasn't been litigated. Now, I would say, so if I'm flying for recreational purposes and I then happen to put it on a YouTube channel and it happens to get monetized, I'm not doing it for as part of a commercial transaction. So if you were hired by somebody, for example, to do real estate photography,
Right.
or if you were hired by somebody to do surveys or things like that, or even in connection with, let's say, a movie shoot or something that's artistic, you're probably still engaged in commercial activity, but the commercial privacy laws actually have an exception where it doesn't apply to the collection of personal information when it's done for journalistic, literary, or artistic purposes, and
Oh,
for no other purpose. And so I like to think I fly my drone for artistic purposes. I really love the video that it captures, and so certainly I would push back really hard if anybody said that PIPEDA applied simply because I might get monetized through a YouTube channel for my
okay.
videos.
Good. Yeah, sorry to interrupt. So getting back to
No, absolutely. Yeah. Kind of the more relevant questions you can ask, and the more, hopefully the more relevant information I'm able to provide in return. So kind of commercial operators need to be thinking about that. And so what PIPEDA requires is if you're subject to that legislation, and the BC, Alberta, and Quebec are equivalent, you can only collect personal information with the knowledge and consent of the individual. And so that's a little bit onerous. And knowledge and consent needs to be, the person knows that their information is being collected and they've consented to it. And there is something called implied consent, and whether you're kind of in an area, you might have seen, for example, in urban areas where they're filming TV shows or others, they'll put up signage, say kind of filming in progress. Kind of, if you enter this area, you could be captured. That's a way of getting implied consent from individuals, so that if they enter that particular area. But also another thing that we need to be mindful of when it comes to at least most drone videos is what is personal information. And right. Personal information is information about an identifiable individual. And so when I'm flying at 100 feet up and 100 feet away from somebody, it's not likely that they're going to be identifiable in a bunch of ways. That obviously kind of the further away, or even kind of further away from a crowd, you have a whole bunch of faces, you're not going to be able to identify an individual in that. And so that's something that gets that is taken into consideration when figuring out kind of to what extent the legislation even applies, because it has to be personal information. And it may simply be that you have individuals have a reduced expectation of privacy in a public place. And so being out in a public place may be implied consent for the incidental collection of information.
Right. Not deliberate, but so if you're spying on somebody, tracking them along a street, that's different than if they happen to walk by while you're filming.
That's right. And that scenario might even trigger laws like harassment. We also have voyeurism laws and nuisance that we'll probably talk about a little bit. And there's some question as to whether or not somebody's house, information about their house, is their personal information. And certainly, at least the privacy commissioners took the view when Google Street View launched a number of years ago, that information about a house could be information about the individual. And we always think about, there's a continuum, how intimate is the information, how sensitive is the information. So a completely generic front view of a house or top view of a house in an ordinary neighborhood is probably not going to tell you much, but you're flying over somebody's backyard and it shows possessions in the backyard that are behind a fence that the person would think that they have an expectation of privacy in, or it kind of discloses things related to their private life and stuff like that. That would get a little bit more sensitive, and that'd be a little bit closer to the line. Certainly, I've given advice to organizations that regulate real estate brokers and to real estate brokers themselves with respect to kind of drone flights, and I guess similar to the Canadian aviation regulations for the small drones, like, yeah, don't be an idiot. Like that, people may be more sensitive than some people may be more sensitive than others. Some people may be more concerned about certain bits of information than others, and it really is a best practice to go around the neighboring houses or drop off a flyer to say, hey, look, that on Tuesday, because we're selling our house, there's going to be a drone operator in the area. They're taking aerial views. They're focusing only on my property. They might incidentally get a couple of neighboring properties. If you have any concerns, contact whoever the pilot is.
Right, right. And that gives you at least a demonstration that you've tried, due diligence, if you like, to inform people that they could be filmed.
Yeah, and given the how information about the exterior of a house is likely not sensitive information, that's kind of an opt-out consent model. And so if somebody doesn't get in touch with the drone operator or the homeowner, then you can say, yeah, there's probably implied consent for this. And it gives them the opportunity. I don't know if they have a pile of trash in their backyard, they'll say, hey, look, please avoid this part of the backyard. But probably if you're trying to sell the house, you're not going to show your neighbor with a pile of trash in their backyard.
There you go. Yeah.
So these sorts of things come into play. But I think with a lot of these things, and you mentioned at the beginning of the video, this is probably the number one concern that is expressed by individuals who don't operate drones. And one thing just also to bear in mind in terms of helping to set people's expectations is that when somebody sees a drone up in the air, they have no idea what its capabilities are.
Right.
And they also have no idea who's operating it, and they have no idea what its purposes are. And I think people tend to assume that they have greater kind of zoom in capabilities, that they're like the Reaper drones that they see on the TV news. And so people will, in many cases, assume the worst. So to the extent that you're able to kind of calibrate people's expectations, in my view, after a number of years practicing in this area, people get upset about privacy when something happens that they don't expect. And so if you can help set people's expectations, particularly, I'll continue to use the real estate operation because that's in close proximity to other people's homes, and you can very often hear it. By dropping off that leaflet and letting people know, and even including a website link to other properties that have been done. So if somebody's interested, if they're sensitive or curious, they can click those links and they can find, oh, well, this is exactly what it's going to be like. And so I don't have to worry, rather than unexpectedly some drone buzzing around what appears to be your windows. It's difficult to tell what direction a drone is pointing if you're not familiar with them. And so if it's pointing at this house over here and that's your house over there, you might think it's actually kind of taking close-up pictures of your house. And so set those expectations and simply kind of be a good neighbor is something that I often say.
Right. So this whole discussion has been focused on the commercial element. So using your example of real estate, and it sounds like the number one thing is ensuring that the public or anyone in your video is, first of all, you're protecting their personal identification, or you've got consent from them to ensure that they're okay, or at least not objecting to you filming them.
That's right. Yeah. That would be, so minimize the amount of information you collect. And if it's so minimal that it's not even personal information, then the statute really isn't engaged. But if there's a risk of identification or re-identification, then it makes sense to let them know and give them either the opportunity to opt out, or even better is to say, look, are you okay with this? And then you've essentially checked those boxes. There's other administrative, you have to have a privacy officer and all that other sort of stuff. But when it comes to interacting with people who you might record, that's the bottom line.
Perfect. Now, what about recreational folks? Like if I'm filming or doing some film, what do I have to worry about?
Yeah, so you're only worried about kind of the torts. So somebody suing you.
I'm always worried about the torts out there. Oh, it's a legal term. Sorry.
How can you not be worried about the torts? So essentially, the torts are when you intrude on somebody else's rights. And that could be a right to privacy. And, we live in a society with thousands and thousands of people. We bump into people all the time. We have an attenuated expectation of privacy. And the privacy torts usually only come into play when there's an interference with somebody's privacy rights in a way that would be highly offensive to a reasonable person is one of the ways, or an unreasonable invasion of somebody's privacy.
Okay.
And the courts are always going to look at it in terms of what's the totality of the circumstances and what was somebody's expectation of privacy. And so walking down the street, so if I was, for example, in a local park, which sometimes people fly drones in the local park, I'm in a local park, I'm visible to everybody and to the whole world. And so if I'm incidentally captured by a recreational operator, I likely had a reduced expectation of privacy in that place. And so being captured would not be highly offensive to a reasonable person. At a distance, not being followed or anything else like that. Or so in those sorts of circumstances, that wouldn't trigger any sort of liability. And people are often surprised that there's no specific law related to the images of children.
Yeah, I was just going to say, what about kids? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a sensitivity to that.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be surprised, because it often happens that the cops get called and they call it suspicious activity, and they're inclined to investigate, because certainly there are really creepy people who do that sort of thing. And so that may be enough for a suspicion for the police to look into it. But in fact, kids' privacy is the same as your privacy, and the expectation is roughly the same when out in a public place. But as a drone operator, don't be creepy, because
I think that's a generally a good rule of life at any time.
Well, that's right, and so be mindful of the legitimate interests of others. So there's the invasion of privacy. There's also a specific tort in common law Canada called intrusion upon seclusion. One who intrudes on the private life or solitude of another in a manner that would be kind of outrageous to a reasonable person is liable for that intrusion. And you don't even have to prove harm in that case, but it has to be outrageous. It has to be something that really does intrude upon their privacy or their private life. And
So let me
yeah,
try an example on you. Suppose, and I only say this because I've actually done it.
sure.
Suppose there's somebody with a sailboat out in the middle of my lake, and it's a beautiful day and a beautiful sailboat. What if I were to go and drone that sailboat? Do a nice orbit around it. Is that what was it?
Intrusion upon seclusion.
There we go.
Yeah, I don't think it would be. So, but I think it would also depend upon how close you got to it and that sort of thing.
Sure.
I'm also a recreational boater. On my boat is where I feel secluded.
Right.
And so
Exactly.
if somebody were to capture, like do a really fantastic 360 around my boat, I'd want to get the video. I think that would be awesome.
Yeah.
But that's just me. Other people I know in the boating community, they go out and they really want to be left alone. And privacy is about being left alone. So at a distance, so if you think of what would another boater see or experience
Right.
at that particular time. One thing that I'm also mindful of when it comes to drones is that uh, and this relates to all kinds of electronic surveillance is kind of how visible is it? Do you know if you're being recorded? So somebody having a quiet day on their own on your lake in their sailboat, they would know when another boat comes by. They would be
Right.
keeping a watch and they'd be keeping it at least at that horizon level. They might not know when a drone is approaching. If you're out in a sailboat on the wind or certainly a motorboat, that would mask the sound of the drone very likely. If I'm sitting in my backyard, I can hear a drone from half a block away, if not further, when it comes to like it's like a flying sewing machine essentially. And so I would at least be aware that there's some sort of observation. But if somebody's truly secluded, like or in a place where they can't hear that or have a good line of sight to it, that really does become like you're covertly looking at somebody.
Right. And that's a specific factor, isn't it? Like being whether it's surreptitious filming or not surreptitious.
Well, that comes into play legally on specifically legally on the voyeurism offense that I'm
Okay.
happy to talk about. But when it comes to kind of how somebody is secluded, if they reasonably think that nobody's around, nobody's observing them, then their level of seclusion would go up. And one of the challenges with the torts is that there's obviously gray areas all over.
Yeah.
And so if I'm in a crowded marina, I don't have an expectation of privacy. If I'm out in the middle of the harbor or 2 miles offshore, I have a greater expectation of privacy.
Right.
Likewise, somebody living in the country, my backyard can be seen. I live in the city. My backyard can be seen from all the surrounding properties. If I live in the country and I have a big field, I would have a much greater expectation of privacy in whatever I'm doing in that field because there wouldn't be people expected to be observing, and I would be able to see anybody approaching. But I might not be mindful of a drone flying over, but I would probably in a quiet country area would probably be able to hear it from even further than a couple blocks away. So
Okay.
if it's highly offensive to a reasonable person or outrageous with respect to their privacy interests, then that could be actionable. And it's always going to look at those particular circumstances. But part of the circumstance, how far away is the drone? What's it capturing? That your video that you described is much more information about the boat than it is about the occupant.
Right. But if in my scenario there is suddenly someone sunning themselves on the deck of that sailboat, perhaps below the level of the sides of the sailboat where they thought, well, nobody can see me here, and now I'm flying my drone around close enough to see that person, that becomes unreasonable.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, in a manner that could be highly offensive to a reasonable person who is, hey, on the weekends, I go out on my boat and I like to tan myself all over or something else like that. Yeah, and so yeah, a court is probably going to say, look, that probably crosses the line.
Right. Right.
But if you were to do it at such a distance that it's just a boat on the horizon or something else like that, no privacy liability would be triggered in that case.
Right.
There's also a related tort called public disclosure of private facts, which is where if you related to somebody's private life and you broadcast, you make it public, so something posted on a YouTube channel could make something like that public. So that'd be kind of added on in that sort of scenario.
So for example, if I expose the fact that this guy had a Jaguar in his backyard, and that's an unusual kind of car to have perhaps in that neighborhood, that would be a public disclosure of a private fact.
It could be. It would still have to be highly offensive to a reasonable person, or outrageous.
Sure.
And so they would look at those particular circumstances.
Okay.
And so the type of car you have might not cross the line, but in some situations it might. And also in the background, privacy damages tend to be modest in terms of nobody's going to get rich suing anybody for an invasion of privacy. The courts in Ontario at least have said, look, the maximum you can get for the just feeling intruded upon is $20,000. And so in a lot of cases, it's not even worth taking a claim of that amount to court, unless you can get it in small claims, which you can under the limit in Ontario. But for example, you can't in Nova Scotia. There's a cap of $100 on those sorts of damages in our small claims court.
Okay.
There's also something called appropriation of personality, which is essentially where you're using somebody's image for a commercial purpose. And there was a woman in Ontario who sued successfully when she was jogging on a public trail, and somebody captured her at a distance, but she was still recognizable, at least to herself. And that image, that video sequence, ended up in an ad.
Oh, okay.
A commercial use of her likeness. And it was a little bit controversial within the privacy community. So while you're completely in a public place, you weren't really recognizable. She could recognize herself. But the court noted, and the videographer would have no idea. The woman in the video had just had a baby, and she was quite concerned about her kind of getting back to her pre-pregnancy body, and so wasn't feeling great and was working hard and jogging on that trail. And so that's a circumstance that will come out in court that the videographer doesn't know. So I would be very, very mindful. And like from time to time, you'll get like an amazing image or an amazing video, and you think, look, this has the potential, like the tourism board is going to love this, or something else like that.
Right.
Before you do that as the video, like that might not have been your intent in taking the recording, but I would probably do what I could to blur out the image or kind of track down the person and get a model release. There are thousands of different ones you can find on the internet. Most of them are reasonable. And get that person's permission, because otherwise, if you use somebody's likeness for a commercial purpose, that they could license to you otherwise, that certainly Sidney Crosby's likeness is worth way more than mine or a random person jogging on a trail in Ontario. But if you use that commercially, and commercially more than just kind of a YouTube video that might be monetized, so for advertising purposes those sorts of purposes, then you can cross that particular line.
So if I did my beautiful orbit of my sailboat, even if it was well back and all the rest of that, and then now sold it to the, as you say, the tourist board, I would be smart to go and try to find that owner of the sailboat to get consent.
That's right. Now, similar to the is it personal information? If there's not enough information from the image that you could identify the sailboat, you've reduced your risk. Right. So like if you could see like the hull number, if you could see the number on the sail and things like that, somebody could say, hey, that's clearly my boat, and somebody could look that up. But frankly, I would recognize my boat at 150 feet or 200 feet, even further. Yep. And so I would be careful about that.
Okay, cool. Very cool. Now, let's talk about voyeurism specifically, because again, getting back to the general public's concern, voyeurism is what they have in mind. Your drone is clearly looking through my bathroom window. So what are the elements that distinguish voyeurism from just flying past somebody's bathroom window?
Well, essentially at its basic level, voyeurism is about peeping toms for a sexual purpose. Okay, that's essentially what it's about, and it's a relatively new addition to the criminal code in the last decade or so. One of these things that taking into account that technology is at a level that it used to be in the olden days, if you were someone was a peeping tom, they would be trespassing. And so there'd already be the trespassing offense or trespassing at night and things like that.
Sure.
Well, with technology, one can do those sorts of things at a distance. And so they added it to the criminal code in a manner that essentially has two sorts of charges within it. One is recording surreptitiously in an area where one would reasonably expect a person to be undressed or engaged in sexual activity. and to do that covertly. So that would be if a changing room, a bathroom, a bedroom, other places like that, a locker room. So just doing that recording in those circumstances in such a place can constitute the offense of voyeurism. But there's also an offense where simply you are doing that observing of somebody who is undressed and otherwise for a sexual purpose.
Okay.
And so there's case law related to, for example, somebody taking photographs at a nude beach, and they were arrested and charged, but they were acquitted because they weren't doing it surreptitiously. They were sitting there with their camera, visibly, annoyingly, I'm sure, offensively, no doubt, problematic to anybody around them, but they weren't doing it covertly. It wasn't sneaky, and so they were acquitted as a result.
Wow, that's hard to believe, but okay.
Yeah, and you know, but that's the way that the offense is worded in the criminal code. So if it's not surreptitious, then that's the case. But you know, that was a public place. There was no signage that said no photography or anything else like that. And those were things that the judge took into account in determining whether or not it was appropriate. Had he been sitting in a car in the parking lot with a really long zoom lens, that would have been a different sort of thing. And we don't actually have any case law, which I suppose is a good thing, because in order to have case law, somebody has to be charged and go through the whole process as to whether or not flying a drone is surreptitious. Right. I would argue, unless it's absolutely silent, it's probably not. It's right. You're not making any effort to hide it unless you're kind of hovering it just below the bushes and then popping up and doing something else like that. And so few things are more out in the open than a drone flying overhead in a sense. But certainly, so that's the second part. But if you go back to the first part, if you're flying a drone at a bathroom window, bedroom window, change room, something else like that, you could absolutely trigger that first part.
Right. The whole sexual and undressed kind of part. Yeah.
That's right. And so certainly I would expect any person who sees a drone out their bedroom window or something else like that is probably going to assume that that's the purpose. It's like the drone may be pointed in the other direction. They might not know, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were to call the police, and the police would investigate and try to get to the bottom of it. Again, you can probably avoid the risk of liability by just being a respectful, sensible person when it comes to interacting with other human beings. Like right. Don't hover near anybody's window of any kind without them knowing. You don't know if you don't know how the house is laid out. You don't know whether it's a bathroom. You don't know whether it's a bedroom or otherwise. And so just be extremely clear and cautious. There's some case called Jarvis, where a teacher was in a school hallway and was using a hidden camera in a pen and was recording the chests of students. And the court took the kind of technology into account in determining whether or not there was an expectation of privacy. And essentially the court said, and this is what I'm mindful for drones, is that, you know, they were used to, and anybody walking down the hallway of a school is used to other people observing them at eye level.
Right.
They don't expect to be observed from below or from above necessarily. If the school has security cameras, even if they're being observed from that level, the security cameras are there for a particular purpose.
Right.
And so I can
see everybody's
that,
got cameras, you know, phones and all right. that kind of stuff. So
that's right.
You have very little expectation of privacy, but
you might have an additional expectation of privacy when it comes to being observed from an unusual vantage point. Right. And drones aren't sufficiently common that everybody's just sort of used to that. And whether that's a good or bad thing, I'm not sure. And so I can see a prosecutor, a cop, or a judge kind of taking that into account. Like, it's different from, you know, we live in the world and we're observed all the time when we interact with other people at eye level, but something from above is not something that you necessarily expect. And I can see the same sort of thing being made if you were flying over a neighbor's backyard and they happen to be sunning themselves in the buff, that an argument could be made that, you know, they have an expectation of privacy in that place. When it comes, they're behind a fence, so you can't see them at eye level. Yep. They had an expectation of privacy that nobody was going to be looking from above, and therefore, if they're undressed, that could trigger the first part of the voyeurism offense.
Right. Whether or not it was surreptitious, so the fact that they're filming them.
That's right.
In the buff.
Well, and kind of is is from above surreptitious just in and of itself, because we're not, and so these questions are a little bit unresolved.
But surely there's some line that could be drawn, not in terms of feet or anything, but that would get into the nuisance aspect of it. Like, how does that?
Nuisance and trespass, and the two are, I guess, similar in terms of, well, to what extent do you own the airspace in your property? Is your property a cube rather than a square? and how high does that cube go? And there's some case law. And one of the problems that exists is the case law has nothing to do with drones, and has things to do with like overhead wires, and has to do with walkways and other things like that. And so you generally own the airspace of your property up to the point that you're reasonably using it or reasonably likely to use it. And it's not owned in the traditional kind of trespass sort of sense. And so, if somebody were to fly a drone below the fence line in my backyard, they're probably arguably trespassing, and there's certainly a nuisance. And so trespass is somebody enters onto your property without your permission or exceeds the permission that you've granted them. And have you implicitly granted somebody permission to fly into that imaginary cube that we don't know where the top of it is? But certainly there comes a point, and if you take it, let's say that the house is 60 feet high and you fly 120 feet over ground level, you're very likely not intruding in any space that they could claim a property interest in.
Right.
You're well beyond.
This is a fascinating point, because, as drone pilots, it's drilled into our head that airspace starts at the grass level, and nobody controls the airspace. But that's not actually true from a legalistic perspective. There's other elements to it, like the enjoyment of that, like you call it, the imaginary cube of where you have some rights.
Well, certainly. So my home exists in the airspace, if you calculate from the ground up to, and so 20 feet up is probably my den, is probably my home office. Yeah. And so just because I get to regulate who comes into my home office, and you can't fly your drone in my window, and that exists in the airspace. So what is it that we're really talking about? And so, like, if my neighbor on the left and my neighbor on the right wanted to get together and kind of run a cable through the air from one house to the other for some, I don't know, some telecom purpose or whatever, they simply can't do it in a way that interferes with my enjoyment of my property.
Right. And the same for drones. They can't fly a drone, below the fence line, or, maybe below the roof line even of your house, because you have an expectation of you potentially using that space for yourself.
And there are other activities. So this gets us straight into nuisance, which are simply interfering with somebody's lawful enjoyment or use of property. And so that doesn't necessarily have to involve a trespass, like entering into the property. But if you're interfering with somebody's lawful enjoyment of the property in a way that's problematic and wouldn't be expected, then that is also a tort. So the person can sue for that. And there are a whole bunch of cases that are not drone related. There's kind of, I don't know, making a whole bunch of noise in your backyard, interfering with your neighbor's ability to do it. Or if your neighbor decided that kind of went completely overboard with his kind of smoker and barbecue habit, and started put a commercial smoker in the backyard, and consistently that wafted through your backyard, that meant that your backyard was no longer usable by you for your purpose, that's a nuisance. And so if you had somebody who has a pool in their backyard and they have a high fence and they expect the kind of privacy and seclusion in there, you're flying your drone in your backyard in a way that observes their backyard may reasonably interfere with their ability to enjoy their property. Right. And so you're engaged in what would otherwise be a lawful activity. They're engaged in enjoying their property in the ordinary sort of way, and that interferes with it, and that can be actionable.
Interesting. Yeah. The whole nuisance thing and intrusion into expected privacy, I think, are really the keys there. Yeah. So let me show you a quick little video that I filmed just the other day, and I'd be interested in seeing your assessment of whether I crossed the line of privacy. So let me play the video here. Okay. So here's my video. Here's my intended shot. I just wanted a shot of the river. But then this property came up as I was setting up the shot. And here's another one where I was turning around. You know, you can see the person's deck. Here's somebody's backyard. And then here's another view of that one of those other properties, and you can see inside the pool. Okay, so what's your assessment of that video?
Well, if that's legally problematic, then a lot of the flying I do is problematic in my neighborhood. If you think so, this is 2024. You can go on all sorts of online mapping products, and you can see aerial images of every property in all of Canada and probably in a significant part of the world. And so, and planes have been flying over properties for ages, and helicopters for slightly less, but at lower levels and even greater visibility. And so I would say an incidental capture like that probably doesn't trigger any particular privacy rights.
Good.
From a legal point of view.
Yeah.
But then again, we're dealing with human beings, and privacy is different to different people and means different things. And people will often assert a privacy interest that isn't legally recognized, that doesn't cross a particular threshold. And my tendency is to, okay, well, if somebody complains about it, take them seriously and see if you can accommodate if they have a reasonable request. If it's not reasonable, then you certainly don't have to do it. And they're going to wave their fists and say they're going to call a lawyer and stuff like that. And they're bluffing 99% of the time. But something at that sort of altitude of an area like that where there are houses, and if there's an adult in the pool, I wouldn't really worry about it. If there's a kid in the pool, I probably wouldn't put it up anywhere.
Right.
But there's nothing wrong with the capture of it. And there's probably nothing legally wrong with even putting it up on your YouTube channel or sharing it otherwise.
Interesting. Yeah. So what if one of those neighbors, say the guy with the pool, for example, came over because he could probably tell where I was. There was an obvious place I was flying from, and started complaining. What would you recommend I do? Would you recommend I start arguing about my Charter of Rights? And
I think I would tend to de-escalate that sort of situation. I would tell them to hold on a moment until the drone is on the ground. And if they're coming up and being reasonable, well, if they're coming up aggressively, I'm going to get the drone on the ground as quickly as I can. If they're coming up and being reasonable, I would ask them to just kind of calm down a moment, and we'll kind of get it on the ground. And then I would just talk to them. I would try to engage with them. Starting off aggressively, saying you don't own the airspace and things like that, or you have no privacy right, blah blah blah. You're not going to get anywhere with that, really.
no,
That you're probably better off if somebody appears like they are willing to engage and have a conversation. I would engage with them, and I would have a conversation.
or maybe show them your screen, and hey, look how cool this is, because what I was trying to do is the river.
Yeah, and so, like, I've had situations where I've said, look, if you give me your contact information, where they've kind of seen my screen, I've showed it to them and said, well, that's really cool. It's like, well, give me your contact information, I'll send you the link to it. You can use that video for whatever purpose you want. I'm more than happy to share that with you.
What if they insisted that you delete the video right there on the spot, or they had called the cops and the cops told you to delete the video?
Well, there's virtually no circumstance in which the cops can lawfully order you to delete a video, and even few circumstances where a private citizen can. And so you can say, well, no, turn it off and walk away.
Or say, I'm trying to do a video of the river. I won't use the part that shows, you in the pool or whatever.
Yeah. It certainly, if based on what it is that you're doing, say, look, that was just incidental. I'm not going to use that, and I'm going to delete the footage that I'm not going to use. And so don't worry about it. But I'm not deleting the last 20 minutes of work to satisfy you. And I would try to say that more politely, but I would end up getting aggressive. It's like, look, if I just captured what I wanted to capture, and that's embedded, this guy's backyard is embedded within that shot, I'm not going to go and redo it just in order to satisfy that guy.
Yeah. So let's turn it around the other way. Let's suppose that you are the person who owns that pool, and you see somebody, flying a drone that appears, at least to you, to be intruding upon your privacy, what would you recommend? Like, how should you behave? What are the actions you should take?
Well, certainly. So in one of the problems I think is just inherent with drones is you don't know who's controlling it and you don't necessarily know where they are.
Right.
So if
But
a
here I am
person were to,
across the other side of the bridge. It's like, there's the guy with the drone right there.
yeah, and so I guess you climb out of the pool, you put on a towel, and you walk across the bridge, and you say, "Excuse me, I was having a quiet moment there. Um, could you please not do that? Or when you see that somebody's in the pool, could you not record? My kids are sometimes in there, and that causes me concern." My approach is generally just to try to engage with people in conversation, because most people will try to be reasonable, and I know you're a reasonable person. I think, okay, well, you would recognize it. My concern is legitimate. It might not be a legal thing that I could sue you for, but
Right.
not everything has to be that. And then we reach some sort of understanding. But the problem is, very often you see a drone, you have no idea where the operator is, that they're not particularly visible, and with particular 250-gram drones, I think people people often do fly them out of line of sight.
Yep.
And so the operator could be a kilometer away.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
and if you're in an open area, you're going to see them. But if you're in a built up area, you're not. So I can see in your background there, one could easily be at the house, and fly it to the end of the lake.
That's right. Yeah.
And somebody at the end of the lake would have no idea and would have hundreds of kilometers to look for you.
They would probably say, "Oh, it's Don flying his drone again." But
That's right.
fortunately, in my neighborhood, a lot of people know that I fly drones, and
Yeah.
I always enforce the regulation that they really should put in the rules, that if you see a drone, you wave. That's the most important rule of all. David, this
Excellent.
has been
I'm a lawyer and I didn't know that rule. Thank you, Don.
David, this has been a wonderful conversation. Your insights and your perspectives and your knowledge have been really, really helpful. And I hope the viewers here will appreciate what the nuances that you've brought to light. And by the way, David does have his own YouTube channel, and I'll put a link in the description below. So have a look at his YouTube channel, including one of the drone. I'll put a link to the video he did about drones and privacy, which gets into a lot of the case law and a lot of the details that we just kind of touched the tips of the waves on today. So thank you, David, for your time and sharing your expertise.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's great to chat, Don. And thanks for everything you and DPAC do for the community.
Thank you.